Hi everyone. We're delighted to be here today to talk to you all from Archways. So my name is Eimear Collins and this is my colleague Paul Johnston. We work with an organisation called Archways based in Dublin, and our main aim and mission is to develop and deliver evidence-based programmes to children, families and educators. And we're here today to talk to you about a topic that we've done quite a lot of work on in the last couple of years, which is understanding anxiety, which is a topic that can be a very, very overwhelming topic for a lot of people. So we're going to try and break that down a little bit for you. Understanding anxiety and some tips on supporting your child as well, if they are particularly anxious or worried.
So then, today, what we're going to be looking at is the correlation between worry and anxiety. We're going to talk about worry, stress and anxiety. Sometimes we hear people say their head is wrecked, they're stressed out, my anxiety is through the roof. And we're going to talk about this in more detail and describe more closely what people might actually be feeling. We're going to look at how anxiety can come about. We're also going to look at the relationship between worry and anxiety. It's not a straightforward process and there can be a lot of confusion involved. We're going to look at worry in more detail and understand its role and function for us, because anxiety begins first and foremost with those worries that come into our heads. We know a lot of people at different times in their lives experience times of worry, stress and anxiety. And everyone can feel anxious, but not everyone will experience anxiety. Just like adults, children also have worries. And that fight, flight and freeze response that we have, that the amygdala in the brain brings about to protect us, that's not harmful, it's perfectly normal. We can feel variations at these times, like a job interview or going to the dentist. So, we have a slide up now on page, I think it's page 3, and you will see the graph shows worry, which is the thinking part, the cognitive part of what we call the anxiety mode. Worry and the thinking piece that leads into stress, that's the fight, flight, freeze response. That's the piece that protects us. That stress that we need in our life in order to survive. Then the combination of those two things that leads into the feeling, which becomes the anxiety. Okay? Now, let's look at worry in a little bit more detail. So then, worry is what happens when your mind dwells on negative thoughts, uncertain outcomes, or things that can go wrong. Worry tends to be obsessive, repetitive thoughts. It's the cognitive thinking component of anxiety. And simply put, worry happens only in your mind, not in your body. Everybody has worries. So then, stress is a normal part of life, and our stress response is a survival mechanism, and it primes us to respond to threats. And it's fired up in the limbic system in the brain, and the amygdala, which is really a part of humankind is not in existence that long. And we needed to be reminded when we had to survive, when we had to take care of ourselves. And it brings about that fight, freeze response. We either run away from something or we face it on fearlessly and fight it, or we flee completely from it. Some of the symptoms are the rapid heartbeat, the clammy hands, that shallow breath. However, not all stress is bad, and we need to experience manageable amounts of stress to develop a healthy stress response system. And that's called acute stress. And I would feel that now, right now at this moment, because this is an uncomfortable experience when you're performing in front of a camera and when you're having to say things to an invisible audience. As soon as this is over, my acute stress levels will drop completely and I'll be back to normal, okay? Chronic stress, on the other hand, is when your body stays in this flight or flight mode continuously. Okay.
I think that's a really important point, Paul, about the acute stress, that need to experience some stress, because I think as parents we often worry about protecting our children completely from all stress, and it's that piece about it is so important that we actually do experience some levels of stress in our lives in order to adequately develop that stress response system. You know, that it's actually a really necessary part.
And it's vital for children to learn how to handle their stress. And vital for parents to model how they handle their stress as well.
Exactly.
You know?
Because
you're modeling to your children all the time, and they will learn how to deal with stress by watching how you deal with yours.
Yeah.
Okay. So, we move on. What happens when worry and stress combine? Anxiety is the culmination of worry and stress. Anxiety has that cognitive element. It has the worry piece. And then the physiological response, the stress, which you're experiencing in both your mind and your body. So then anxiety is defined by that persistent, excessive worry. Worries that don't go away, even in the absence of a stressor. So anxiety is when these concerns become so overpowering that they affect our day-to-day functioning. And I'm just going to explain a little bit more about that, especially in the absence of a stressor. And what does that mean? Let's say, for instance, you are afraid of dogs, okay? So, but it's not really a major problem for you. Most of the time it's at the back of your mind. You've got this little worry about dogs, but you don't come into contact with them too much. And then one day you leave your house to go down to the local shop to pick up your paper and your bread and your milk. And as you're passing by the new neighbour's garden, a dog runs out at you suddenly. And you jump and you say, oh my God, you know. You continue on down to the shop, but you're worried. You're saying to yourself, jeez, I didn't know there was a dog there. It's a big dog. And you pick up your paper and your bread and your milk. And as you start walking back up the road, you start to worry in advance. You haven't seen the dog yet, but you're worrying and you're starting to feel, what if that dog is there? What if it runs out at me again? And you gingerly go past that gate and you make it safely to your house. Okay. Next day you come out and you're heading down the road to get your paper, bread and milk again, and you think, wow, hang on, what if the dog is there? I'll cross over. So you cross over the street, and so you're not close to the dog. And the dog is there, and it does run out, and even though you're across the street, you're still feeling that kind of anxiety, that stress in your body. You're afraid, and you probably move faster down the road. So you get your bread, your paper, and your milk, and you decide, okay, I've got to go back. But I don't want to have to pass the dog again. So how am I going to manage this? So you say, I know, I'll go the long way home. Now, this worry that you haven't dealt with, the stress that you're feeling in your body, has caused this anxiety that makes you change the pattern of your day. Now you're feeling anxious, and you're already starting to avoid. Okay? So, there's a model of worry, and it's on slide 7, which you'll see in a few moments. And the model of worry is, first of all, there's the trigger. And the trigger can be the dog, the barking. And you start to worry about it. And the more you worry, the more then you feel it in your body. And we all feel stress in different ways. You know, some people will have clammy hands, some people will start shallow breathing, you know, palpitations, they'll go red in the face, feeling sweaty, all of those things. The combination of the worry and the stress then leads to that anxiety. And in a normal set of circumstances, when we experience worry, we can remain calm and we can problem solve. And when we problem solve worries, we resolve them. So that's what I want you to take with you today is, if you can problem solve at the worry stage, it's not likely to go to stress, and then it certainly won't lead into anxiety. And one of the things about worry is we never take a day off sick for worry, but we can take time out from work or our personal life just because we're stressed or we're feeling really anxious. So if you can stop it at the worry piece, then you've got it beaten in advance. Okay. Again, slide 8 is what we call the worry cycle. And when you have a look at this worry cycle, you'll see it's like a hamster wheel. And you've got on the top, you've got feeling overwhelmed, you've got poor problem solving, feelings of uncertainty, and overthinking or lack of action. And what I want you to think about here is, if you look at the worry cycle and look between feeling overwhelmed and poor problem solving, Imagine you get up one morning and you open your post and you have a bill, an ESB bill, a gas bill, whatever kind of a bill it is. And you open it up and it's for a much larger amount than you thought. And you say to yourself, what am I going to do about this? Geez, I don't have the money to pay for this. So you're going out to work, you don't deal with it there, you put it into the drawer. You know that drawer that we all have that we bury things in? So it goes into that drawer and it's out of the back of your mind, you've forgotten about it. Great, okay. Now you can get on with your day, you do your day's work, you come home that evening, you don't go to the drawer, it's not the first thing you think about. Next time, in fact, you go to that drawer, it's to put other stuff into it. And you're burying that bill deeper and deeper in the drawer. You're putting it further into the back of your mind. It means you haven't dealt with it. You haven't problem solved. You haven't even looked at it. Then, sometime during the month, you get this strange feeling. You wake up and you say, gosh, I have a bill somewhere I need to pay. And those feelings of uncertainty start to creep in. And you still don't deal with them. And then you start overthinking. The lack of action causes you to overthink. How much was the bill for again? Was it 5 or was it 600? Gosh, I can't even remember. Again, you still don't do anything because you're lying in bed. You're not getting up to go downstairs to look in the drawer to find out what this bill is about. Now you're feeling overwhelmed about it. And all that happens is the feeling of being overwhelmed continues, increases, and gets stronger. Eventually, you're going to have to open that drawer and look at what the bill is and pay it. It's when we don't deal with these things immediately that all of these feelings come in, and it leads us to becoming anxious and suffering with anxiety. Bills can cripple if you allow them to. Some of the common triggers for anxiety, and especially for your children, are falling out with their friends, loneliness, bullying, struggling with their schoolwork, being ill, or a friend or a family being ill, someone dying, moving house can be a big one, moving school, getting a new step family, parents separating, and COVID-19 recently. They're common triggers for our children, but they're also triggers for us. We also are affected by all of the common triggers, and we all react differently to them. Some people can handle their anxiety. In fact, they don't let it become anxious. You know, they get a little bit stressed, they deal with the stress, or they have a worry and they deal with the worry. So then, what keeps anxiety going? Well, it's the thoughts, you know, because that's the first thing. We talked about worry being cognitive. So your thoughts keep it going. The thoughts then will lead into the feelings that affect you, the physiological side of things. All of those physical sensations that come in that affect you and may affect the way you behave. And it's a combination of all of those things that keeps the anxiety going, spinning, and increasing. Some of the thoughts that we have are, the world's a dangerous place. I don't feel safe here anymore. People don't like me. They're not nice. It's lots of bad things happen to me. I can't cope. And then finally, I have no control over the things that happen to me. And it's a rumination. It's all of these thoughts happening together that's problematic. One alone is just a thought. It's the cycle which is part of anxiety. So finally, before I hand over to Eimear, I want you to think about, where does anxiety happen in your body? How does stress affect you? And as I said, we're all different. How we experience anxiety varies from one person to the next. We can carry anxiety in different parts of our body. So just pause and think, where do I carry it? How do I deal with it? How do I model my dealing of my anxiety to my children?
So I think, Paul, you've gone through there sort of what is it that keeps anxiety going, and you know we've looked at the you know that cycle which is on slide 10. which is on slide 10, around what keeps anxiety going. So we've got the thoughts, the feelings, the physical sensations, and the behaviours. So the thoughts and feelings piece that Paul has kind of briefly mentioned there, we've looked at, but the physical sensations, which, you know, you kind of got people to think about. And I think even, I know we've had this conversation, you know, even how we would experience anxiety would feel very different. People have such different responses physically to it. So for some people it might be shallow breathing and sweating. For others it might be feeling very dizzy or getting that kind of lump in their throat. Something that I always think is a really good description of how we respond to things is, and you covered it briefly talking about, you know, the amygdala and that kind of fight, flight, freeze response, is that we are like very new machines operating on very old software. So, you know, our brains kind of haven't caught up with the world that we live in. So to some extent that fight, flight, freeze response is almost like our body telling us that it can't tell the difference between, you know, our ancestors being chased by a bear versus me having to sit an exam, and that we sort of, we don't have the ability, our bodies still respond in that very kind of frightened way to them. So I think that's sometimes a good way of using it. But just to bear in mind, I think for anyone looking at this today, that those physical symptoms vary hugely from person to person, and how you as a parent may experience anxiety may be completely different to how your child experiences anxiety, and to maybe keep that in mind in terms of them supporting them, which I'll get to in a second in terms of talking about the some of the strategies. So our behaviours also keep anxiety going. There's a couple of behaviours in particular, which is on slide 14. We have things like crying, avoidance, and I'll talk about that further in a minute or so. Becoming very quiet and withdrawn, being very irritable, excessive reassurance seeking, and safety behaviours. So all of these things keep anxiety going. But a useful way of looking at it is that the behaviour is like an iceberg. So what we see above water of an iceberg, that's the behaviour. So that might be your child having an outburst. What's going on beneath the surface, which is the majority of that iceberg, is the thoughts, the feelings, and the physical sensations. So there's a huge amount going on. The behaviour is just the kind of externalization of that anxiety. So that's what we see at the surface, is that behaviour. A lot of the behaviours that we tend to use around kind of managing our anxiety, or that we try to manage our anxiety, are those safety behaviours. And you made reference to that, Paul, in your example about the dog. That's a classic example. Even if it's not a dog, we all tend to, if something frightens us, for example, even in a social situation, if we're afraid, take for example a typical teenage behaviour, we're worried what people are going to think about us if we're in a group of our peers. We may actually avoid that situation rather than facing it, worrying about what people are going to think, and worrying about how people will perceive us to be. So a huge amount of those behaviours that keep anxiety going are actually safety behaviours. In the short term, our anxiety may decrease. In the long term, it actually does the opposite, because what may end up happening, like your example of the dog, is that longer term, we actually become more and more worried, and we stay at home more and more, and then our anxiety actually becomes worse, and it's really starting to impact on how we live our lives every day, because we're not going out and about, and that's a really classic example, I suppose, particularly around childhood anxiety, of how it can really start to impact on people's lives. Things like school refusal start to become an issue, not wanting to go out with their friends, and things like that. So in terms then of starting to look at some strategies that we actually would use to manage anxiety and to support young people, one of the first thing that we always talk about, and one of the most effective ways of starting to help a child manage their own anxiety, is to help them to label emotions and give feelings a name. So by doing that, it sounds a little bit cliche, but it's essentially the idea of a problem shared is a problem halved, that kind of age-old phrase. But essentially what it means is that we help children to externalize the emotional content. So they're feeling, all these feelings are going on for them. They may not be able to name them. So by giving them an emotional, what we would sometimes call an emotional vocabulary, vocabulary or an emotional language. We're actually helping them to externalize the problem. So they're bringing it outside of their body and naming what it is. We can model that, we can support children with it. So we can say things such as, you know, it seems like you're very frustrated about what has happened. I can see that you're very proud that this happened for you. You look very confused, or, you know, yeah, it looks like you felt really angry when, you know, you had that fight with your friend, or whatever it is that's going on. And it's that piece of, as I said, bringing it outside the body and giving them that language so that they can, the next time they feel that, now they know what it is that they're feeling. And also explaining that no feeling is invalid. At any point of all of our lives, all of us will feel these emotions. We might think that they're bad, but feeling them isn't the problem. It's how we might respond to those emotions that becomes the difficulty, rather than the feeling itself. So actually labeling emotions and giving feelings in the name is a really important strategy from the get-go. This next graph, which is on slide 16, is called the anxiety curve. It comes from CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is often seen as the kind of gold standard therapeutic approach for supporting and managing anxiety. It's essentially the idea that each time an issue or problem is faced or solved, the level of anxiety about that issue or problem decreases. So, Paul, you've already referred to problem solving, and that's essentially what we're talking about here. We're talking about supporting your child, your young person, to actually begin to solve their problems, to deal with the issue, rather than using those behaviours that I just spoke about, those kind of avoidance or safety behaviours that we tend to possibly engage in sometimes. It actually, by facing it head on. So if it's a worry about failing an exam in school, rather than not going to school on the day of the exam, actually going and seeing how you get on, it will actually help to decrease the worry about it, even though there may have been huge anxiety around it. This isn't easy. Sometimes, looking at this anxiety curve, it's very difficult for parents to see their child upset or distressed. You know, it's a very difficult thing to do, but really long term, you're serving them so much better by actually helping them to begin to solve their problems rather than helping them to avoid them, which just keeps that anxiety going.
And as parents, we do tend to want to solve all our children's problems.
And we just want to protect them from them, don't we? You know, we don't want that to be the case. So just before I kind of go into any more strategies, parents are the best people to help their children overcome anxiety. So And that's not something that I say to kind of add additional pressure to parents who might already be worried about their child's anxiety, but it's essentially the idea that parents can have a stronger impact on their child's overall well-being than any therapeutic supports. Therapeutic supports are absolutely necessary in some cases, but that parents really have such a strong role to play there as well. And you can play such an important role in helping them if you have some of the tools in how to do that. At a time when it can be so worrying and so stressful for you yourself, and I'll talk about that as well in a moment. One of the things that is important to note is that traditionally we used to think that the first, what is generally referred to as the kind of early childhood period of birth to 6 and specifically birth to 3 was the most important time in the kind of cognitive or brain development of any young child. And it is a hugely important period. It's a hugely important time. But we kind of used to think that that was almost it. And after that, it was very difficult to affect change in young children's cognitive development. We now know that that's not the case. A process called neuroplasticity, which essentially is the ability of the brain to be flexible, means that all throughout life, and particularly at times throughout childhood, there is that ability for parents particularly to be really effective at supporting their children to make some of those changes to overcome that anxiety that they may have. So specifically the age from about 9 to 14 becomes another very important, kind of that early pubescent age group almost becomes a really important age group as well. So in terms of strategies for managing anxiety, and the first one we always start with is to talk about, again, parents' reactions to anxiety has a huge impact on how children deal with it. So they pick up, young children, teenagers, pick up so much on how those of us around them react to their anxiety. So, anxious children are generally kind of more frightened than non-anxious children. And then that can be, how that is managed and dealt with by the people around them can impact how they deal with it. So, for example, if you've got a very anxious child and you then have a parent who picks up on that child's anxiety, if that parent responds to the anxiety in a very anxious way,
of course,
what tends to happen, which is, exactly, it's such a natural, reaction to it. And often it might be the case the parents themselves are so anxious at this point. But what that does mean is that the child then might learn to be quite frightened by it. And that cycle, it almost becomes cyclical. How the response is back to the child impacts how they're next going to deal with it. So parents' responses to that anxiety are very, very important. So this is where we talk about modelling and the importance of how we model our responses back to children. So if we can try, if our child is anxious, to respond in a calm way to their worries, then what tends to happen is that the child picks up on their parents' confidence, and it kind of can break that cycle to some extent. So the parent is modelling back that this is a really, it's not as scary as I thought. Mom or dad or whoever it is, the caregiver, teacher, whoever it is in the circumstance has shown confidence in me, so I don't need to be as worried.
And that may be a new skill for that parent, responding in a calm way, because if their normal mode of operation is to be anxious themselves, they have to learn then to model that calmness to their child.
Yeah. Absolutely.
To build up the child's confidence.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So then in terms of, I suppose, developing resilience, and resilience is a term that's become increasingly kind of a buzzword almost in the last couple of years. What it essentially means is the ability to adapt in the face of adversity. We all have a certain level of resilience. Some of our resilience has been tested more than others. It's a very individual thing, and it actually fluctuates throughout our lifetimes how resilient we are. But parents again have a really, really strong role in supporting the development of their children's resilience, and there's 3 key ways that they can do that. So supporting responsive relationships. So that's literally parents having a relationship with their child and trying to foster and nurture a relationship with their child where there is that openness, where children feel they can come to their parents and talk about how they're feeling. That's the first step in developing resilient children. Strengthening core life skills is the second part of that. That's things such as independence and, most importantly, problem solving, which you've already mentioned. So problem solving is a hugely important life skill to support children in the development of, because it really is where they can start to, if we think back to that anxiety curve, it's where they can really start to jump in, and maybe when some of those worries start to come up, they know, well, how can I control the controllables? What can I control in this situation? What can I do about it? And hopefully then it won't kind of become anxiety. It won't become, that real kind of impactful worry and anxiety.
And problem solving is not something that's common, because we don't generally teach our children how to problem solve. And it's something that we expect of them just to be able to do instinctively. And yet some people are good at problem solving and others are not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of the kind of tendency and I suppose our emotional, we're talking about children that we're emotionally connected to, so it's very difficult to not want to do. We have a couple of things that we tend to do often as adults when children come to us worried. We tend to try and soothe away their worries.
Yes.
We try to make them feel better. We say things like, don't cry, it'll be okay. And sometimes what that does is that it teaches the child that emotion is a bad emotion, and it doesn't give them the skills for problem solving. As you said, sometimes we're not very good at it. We haven't learned those skills. So really actually giving them those life skills is so important in the development of their resilience skills. And then reducing sources of stress is the third kind of key way of supporting the development of resilience. And we've already spoken, you did at length, Paul, about why it's so important that we do experience some stress in our lives. We can't kind of wrap children in cotton wool and think they'll never experience stress. We actually have to. We can't develop a stress response system unless we have been stressed. But at the same time, looking at, are there overwhelming stressors in children's lives that maybe we do have control over and that we can look at supporting the reduction of. So as well as kind of looking at that resilience piece, one of the things that's very important in supporting children's resilience is kind of showing them that things are safe. And sometimes, sometimes we think that in order to show children that things are safe, we need to do that kind of wrapping them up in cotton wool thing that we have a tendency to do. But in reality, we show children that things are safe in totally different ways, such as asking their opinion, encouraging them to think for themselves, not being judgmental or dismissive of their suggestions, actually kind of trusting that they will often come up with very good solutions themselves, showing confidence in them that you believe they can manage, letting them learn by trying different ways of doing things. And that can be really tricky because we might think we know the best way to do it. But sometimes we have to kind of let them try and let them make mistakes, even if we know it's going to be a mistake.
Of course, and learn by those mistakes and through those mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that's problem solving. They're by making those mistakes, they're learning, actually, maybe there's a slightly different way that I can do this. And suggesting coping thoughts, actually, if it doesn't work, I can try again and try it maybe a different way. Leading on from that kind of safety, sometimes, parents are very worried about, how do I respond when they come to me with those worries? Like, what is it that I do when they do come to me with these worries? So one of the things, again, back to kind of problem solving and looking at their resilience, is looking at, is this worry realistic or unrealistic? So actually, and that can be with quite a young child or with a teenager. It's not, specifically for any particular age. If it's a realistic worry, then again, you're looking at, maybe this might be more, it tends to be maybe older children who might come with those very kind of concrete, I'm worried about this particular exam that's coming up, for example. So if they're worried about failing the exam, then sitting down and thinking, okay, what are all the possible solutions to this? Do I need to go to my teacher and talk to them about it? Do I need to study harder? Do I need to set up a timetable for studying for this exam? Whatever. And just letting them thrash it out and think of all the possible solutions to it. If their worries are unrealistic, which is often the case, particularly for younger children, but happens to us all, I think, even as adults. So, for example, there's a monster under my bed, being a classic example. There's a couple of things that we can do there, such as distraction is a really effective tool with younger children around worries, and also setting up an experiment to test the worries. So again, rather than kind of being dismissive of those worries, oh, don't be silly, there's no monster under your bed, you're fine, go to bed. Those things that we might tend to say, actually helping them to figure out that this isn't something I need to worry about. Because again, we're modelling to the child at that point that if you're worried about something, you can just test it out sometimes and see, is this something that I need to worry about? And a strategy that can be really effective there, actually, with children, is to write down the worry, and once it's dealt with, to actually rip it up. It's a very visual way of doing it for small children.
A nice way of getting rid of a worry that's at the back of your mind, because once it's gone, it's gone. Once it's been problem solved, it's gone.
Yeah, exactly. And then the final strategy kind of that we talk about, and it seems very simple, but it's probably one of the hardest things for us to do, is listening. And that sounds, as I said, very simple, but most of us aren't good listeners. We think we are, but actually we're not really. That phrase that we have one mouth and two ears, but we sometimes don't listen as well as we like to think we do. So we really encourage you, particularly if you have a child who is quite anxious, to think about, okay, am I really giving my child my full attention when they're coming to me with their worries. So, listen to what they're saying. And it's really important for them to do that, to kind of share their stories and tell you their worries. And it helps them kind of make sense of the world as they're doing that, because it can just be so overwhelming for young people to have these worries. So actually having the opportunity to talk them through, and it also means as they get older, they're more likely to continue to come to you to tell you those things. We do know that particularly as they reach the teenage years, children will possibly start to talk to their peers more than their parents about these things.
Absolutely.
We all know that.
Yeah.
But it is important that they know that you are there if they do need it, and that they can talk to you openly about what's going on to them, for them. And it also teaches them, which I kind of referred to earlier, that piece that emotions and feelings are totally valid. They're not bad. There's no such thing really as a bad feeling. It might not feel very good for you at the time, but that it is totally normal, and that it will pass, and that, it is possible to overcome that. So they're just some of the key strategies that we always kind of talk about. They're, as I said, not particularly, they're sort of fairly basic strategies, but they can make a huge difference when they're really implemented in relationships. Just the last piece that we'll talk about, and it just goes back again to us talking at the beginning about how sometimes parents themselves are incredibly anxious about their children and their children's anxiety, and that means that the parents themselves might be really, really struggling. So we always try to finish when we talk about things like this. We always try to finish by talking a little bit about self-care, and about the importance of kind of putting on your own oxygen mask first, or some of those phrases like you can't fill from an empty cup, or those sorts of things. It's just really, really important. And just to reiterate that self-care is never a selfish act. It's not by any means. It doesn't make you a bad parent if you try to look after your own self-care. Actually means you're in a better position to support your child when you yourself are looking after yourself. And self-care has become a little bit of a kind of consumer-based, escapist sort of term in the last couple of years, as if it's something that we have to go out and buy something to look after our self-care.
Indeed.
And it's not that at all. It's about knowing what works for us, and that will be very different from person to person. Is it spending time with the people you love? Is it going to the gym? Is it meditating? It can be a hugely different definition of self-care from person to person, but actually taking a little bit of time to think, what is it that works for me in my own management of my anxiety? What helps me when I'm feeling anxious, and particularly if that anxiety is related to your child, because it can just become incredibly overwhelming.
It just so happens, that's my favourite slide of the whole programme, is slide 23, managing stress, worry and anxiety, self-care, putting on your own oxygen mask first. And it's the reason they say it to us when we travel away on a plane. In the case of emergency, your oxygen mask will drop down. If you are travelling with a child, put on your own oxygen mask first, purely and simply because it means that you are in control then to be better able to help your child.
Yeah.
And that's what this is about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really helps with that, when we talked earlier about that cycle of how children pick up on our responses. If we can try to make sure that we're in a better position kind of with our own mental health and well-being, it means that we can be better at those responses, being more calm, and then we're modelling that back to our children. So we're really giving them a great skill by modelling that back to them. So we just have this diagram on slide 24, and it's just a way of kind of visualising, I suppose, what tends to happen, because I'm sure many of you will kind of you'll kind of see yourselves in something like this, which is that, at the top of that graph, you can see, what we would say is a balanced and healthy life. When things are going okay, things are all right. We feel like we've kind of got a good balance between maybe work, life, we're doing okay. But as things get busier, or as we're worrying possibly a little bit more, or if we have an anxious child, that things start to become stressors for us, we tend to give up things as we go along. But the tendency is that we don't give up the things that cause us stress. We give up the things that we think of as optional. And those things tend to be our own self-care. So we tend to give up the things such as going to the gym, going for a swim, reading a book, whatever it is that makes us feel better. They're the things that we drop first. And then, as you can see, kind of with that funnel, as you get further down along, our focus becomes only the things that we perceive as important. And they tend to be the things that don't really nourish us. So we tend to, put a lot of focus maybe on work and being a parent, and that's it. We're not really doing anything for ourselves. We're really just focusing on that, and it can lead to exhaustion and burnout when that happens. So just to be very aware of that. And there's a couple of things that really, really help us with managing stress, and I've referred to them already, and just to encourage people to kind of think about what works for them. But social support, things like good nutrition, meditation, good sleep routines, exercise, getting out in nature, leisure activities, all of those things massively help us to manage our stress, and in turn then to help our children to manage their stress. So
would you suggest that parents timetable that type of stuff in, timetable in their sleep, their exercise, and notice nature?
Absolutely. We all live our lives in very routined ways. We tend to make time for certain things. We tend to put ourselves at the very, very bottom of that. So absolutely, I think that's a really good idea, to actually almost set aside time every week for, that's your time, and that's not kind of negotiable. And I know that can be tricky. People's circumstances are tricky, but it doesn't have to be long, but it can be something that's really nourishing for us, So I think it's really, really important that parents look after themselves in this. It's a huge part of it, not just for yourself, but as we've talked about, that modelling piece is so important. So our children are learning massive amounts from us about how to manage anxiety and how to manage worry. So if we're good role models for them in terms of, how we do it, then we're giving them a really good set of tools with that. Yeah. So that's the end of the presentation. So thank you very much, everyone.
Deal with the worry, and it won't turn into stress or anxiety.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.